Welcome to the podcast. This podcast is going to be entitled A Few Things About the Second Amendment. This is not like a comprehensive analysis of the Second Amendment. It's just a few things that I thought we could talk about as far as the Second Amendment goes. So at Lexington and Concord, first they had a little skirmish at Lexington. It wasn't even really a skirmish. It was just kind of somebody shot a gun off. It was probably an American militiaman, and then the British shot at the Americans, and then the Americans ran away. There was 40 of them there, something like that, and they weren't ready for a fight. They were really just standing there watching the British go by, because the British were on their way to Concord, and the British said, "Hey, get out of here." And they didn't. So that's really the first fighting of the Revolution. That shot is the shot heard around the world. I know that, can't remember his name, somebody wrote a poem later on about the fighting at Concord Bridge, saying that was the shot heard around the world, and that's where the phrase was coined. So maybe he's right. But it makes more sense that, because that wasn't one shot, it was a volley, right? It was firing on the bridge. So that one, anyway, I don't know. But the shot heard around the world is always what I've heard is the one at Lexington. So the British go on to Concord. Everybody's alerted. And so what do Paul Revere and I think it's William Dawes, what do they do during the night? Do they run over to the leader of the militia who's in a barracks or something and say, "Hey, bring them out"? No, they go to house to house. They go from house to house warning everybody that the British are coming, for the militia to come out. Okay? And I guess he would have said the regulars are out. That's just some trivia, because they were all British, right? But they were starting to think of themselves as Americans. So, but as far as I know, he wasn't saying the British were coming. He was saying the regulars are out. And they didn't know what they were going to do. Why are there soldiers roaming around? They were going to go to Concord to seize their weapons in Concord, the militia's weapons. So at Concord, I think 800, I think that's the number, 800 militia, because they had been training people. The Continental Congress had told all the states, get some militia ready. Now, states had always had militia because they needed to defend themselves against the Indians, and they had fought in the French and Indian War. And so they were just kind of this security force that trained, and I don't know all about it, but they were all citizen soldiers. And I don't think they went to train, but they used their own weapons. And so it wasn't just guys shooting their guns, drinking beer, but also but on the other end of that spectrum, it wasn't like a professional army. So when they show up to Concord, they think the British are burning the town down, because they're burning some of the stuff that they found, and they had these things called Liberty Poles. It was like a sign of protest to the British, and they were burning their Liberty Pole. And so they show up ready to fight because they think they're burning down the town of Concord, which was kind of the big town in the area. So it's quite a few guys that show up, and they start fighting the British. And the British were like, well, let's get out of here anyway, because we found some of what we came for. Most of it had been evacuated, most of the equipment. And they fight on Concord Bridge. And there's a full-on little battle that goes on there. And then the British hightail it out of there. But on the way back to Boston, the Americans keep showing up and shooting at them from behind buildings, behind trees, whatever. And the British, there's kind of this running battle all the way back to Boston. So those are all militia. And those are all guys who had their own guns. Yes, some of them were organized and paid by the government to, go train. But at the same time, they were all just guys. I remember there's a story where one of the guys from Concord as he's leaving his house, he tells his wife something like, take care of the kids. Because he doesn't know what he's going to run into. He doesn't know if he's going to come back. Think about, and after that, when the British go back to Boston, it isn't anymore because they've filled in that back bay with landfill. But Boston was like a peninsula. Okay, so it was a good shipping area because it was like a peninsula. So there was this narrow neck of land that you could bottle Boston up by. So 20,000 militia came out and camped outside of Boston to keep the British in. And so those are just guys with guns. Some of them were organized. I don't know, maybe all of them were organized. But they were all just citizens who showed up to keep the British out of the interior of Massachusetts again. So that's a big example of militia and just people with guns. At the Battle of Saratoga, later on in the war, about the midpoint, Burgoyne's army is moving through New York, upstate New York, and running into a lot of problems with militia. There's one town where all the men were gone, and the women fought off the British with the guns that were left. Right? That's not the militia, the organized militia, the National Guard. That's just people with guns. So as he gets close to Saratoga, he starts threatening the populace, hey, if you guys fight us, I'm going to unleash the Indians on you. So as they get close, like 5,000 militia come out and join up with the army. I don't know how organized they were, but a ton of them come out. You would think if they were all organized and tramping around fighting the British, they would already be in the fight. But they all come out and they help. They probably enabled the Americans to win that battle. And Saratoga is what allows the French to come in on our side because we defeat and capture an entire British army. And the French realize, hey, we should get in on this because if the British are going to lose, that'll be a big boon for us. So it gives credibility to the American cause in France. So you can credit dudes with guns who came out to defend New York for winning Saratoga and turning the tide of the Revolutionary War. After the war, they had Shays' Rebellion in western Massachusetts. I can't remember the whole backstory, but there were farmers in the West who were being required to pay their debts in gold, but gold was impossible to get, and all they had was continental dollars, and so they were getting mad. So they started a rebellion against the bad government in Boston. Just like they had done before. If we're going to fight the British for bad government, then we're going to fight the people in Boston for bad government. So they almost overthrow the government of Massachusetts. And this scares a lot of people, and this is one of the reasons that they had the Constitutional Convention. Because everybody's like, hey, if we're going to have these small states, is this going to be constant rebellions all the time? How are we going to deal with this? The government of Massachusetts almost got overthrown by a mob. That's one of the reasons at the convention they give the president the power to suppress insurrections. But notice at the convention, all the people who came who were upset about Shays' Rebellion and worried about Shays' Rebellion, did any of them talk about taking those guys' guns? Did the government of Massachusetts go in and take everyone's guns in western Massachusetts? No. Now, I don't know, maybe they arrested a few guys, but it wasn't a wholesale, you guys are rebels now. We're going to take all your guns. No. No one ever mentioned a thing about that at the convention, going back to the convention. That would have been completely insane for anyone to say that. They had just fought a 10-year war, 8-year war against the British, and a lot of it was done with private weapons and private militia or private citizens. That was part of the American experience, was to be armed, and not just with a pistol, but with the same kinds of weapons that the British military had. Did anyone at any point during the Revolution talk about taking people's guns? No. No. Go find me one. But on the contrary, there are tons and tons and tons of quotes from all different kinds of founders talking about that the people have to be armed in order to remain free, and that they should be armed in order to fight off a bad government. That was why. Not so they could defend against robberies, not so they could hunt. Those two. But the main reason was so they could fight off a tyrannical government, so they would never be under tyranny again. That is the point of the Second Amendment. And that is the point of our right to keep and bear arms that the Second Amendment recognizes. The Second Amendment doesn't give us the right to defend ourselves. We are born with the right to defend ourselves. The Second Amendment acknowledges that in law. Madison says, I think it's in a speech in Congress, and he says that, or maybe it's in one of the Federalist Papers, I can't remember. He's arguing a different point, or in the course of him arguing, he says the United States has an advantage over every other country because the people are armed. And so if somebody invades, the people are a ready fighting force because they're all armed already. So he doesn't mean the militias. He means the people themselves are armed. And he just kind of says that in passing, as if it's a given, as if everyone knows it and assumes that that's how America is, because that's how it was. So let's look at the text of the Second Amendment, which this argument that it just means that states can have militias is so annoying. Okay, it says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. If you understand the context of the times, it makes complete sense. If you want to rewrite it in your mind, and there's a really, really stupid video on the Young Turks where Cenk goes in and tries to parse this and say it doesn't mean what it just obviously says. It's just embarrassing. Okay. What Madison is saying is states need militias to be free. States should have militias. And in order to have a militia, the people need to be armed. That's what he's saying. And that doesn't mean states need militias, so states need militias. Why does it say the right of the people to keep and bear arms? But before that, it said a well-regulated militia. So what they argue is the militia means the state-run National Guard, the official National Guard. But when it says people, it doesn't mean people. It also means the militia. Just the guys in the militia get to keep and bear arms, not the average citizen. Well, how do you have a militia without average citizens having guns? And if this meant that this is maybe one of the best arguments. I heard this first from Mark Levin, but if this meant only that the state can have a militia, this is a change. So this isn't a honoring of individual rights. This is saying, hey, everybody, only states can have militias. Who would have voted for that? Why would this even be put in the Constitution? No one would have voted for that. So it can't mean that. It's so stupid. This is such a stupid argument. It's right there. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The first part doesn't negate the second part. It's so dumb. It's just people who don't want regular people to have guns, and they're trying to figure out how to make it mean something that it obviously doesn't mean. Think about it. The Bill of Rights, except the last two amendments, are just about individual rights. The whole thing is about individual rights, not restructuring the Constitution, not laying out the powers of the states. individual rights. And this one isn't. This one's about limiting the rights of individuals and declaring that states need their own militias. That doesn't make any sense. And think about this. They had already put in the Constitution that states would have their own militias paid for by the federal government, but integrated with the federal government so they could be called up to fight alongside the federal military. So why do you need this amendment to mean that? You already have it established in there that the states are going to have their own militias. This is redundant. You don't need it. Madison would have known that. So all the militias in the Revolution and before the Revolution were citizen soldiers who had their own guns, whether they were in a militia or not. Also, George Mason in a speech says, now what is the militia? The people with guns. That's what he said. Now, there's an organized militia and there's just the militia that can be called up. The militia was every man 18 to 45. And everyone, they assumed that they would have guns, and if needed, they would defend the colony. Remember, this is on the frontier. So they need a militia to defend themselves sometimes. It's not for hunting. It's not for just protecting yourself from a home invasion. It is for those. But it's also for fighting off a tyrannical government. The founders said it all the time. And they had just fought off a tyrannical government. So just keep that in mind when you hear all this BS about the Second Amendment. Thank you for listening.